Hello and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This video is going to contain spoilers for the entirety of the whole game. Don't watch, don't listen. If you haven't played the whole thing, you won't know what's going on. And also a general content warning for on-screen footage that will have descriptions of gore and torture. And a little bit of discussion of that, but it's not really going to be the focus of what I'm talking about in this video. And we're going to be covering episodes 3, part 11 and 12 of my Let's Play, which cover the discovery of the second Twilight and the enacting of the next 3 Twilights. And because we are deep in actual murder territory, just a quick note that any speculation on the how of the murders will be all put to the end. We'll discuss themes and stuff first, and in the timestamps you can see when I begin talking about what I think happened and how. First, we're going to return a little bit to a topic that's come up a few times, but there's a little interesting dynamic to it here. When everyone discovers that Rosa is missing, and then they notice the chain is off the door, I took note of a line where Kraus will look at the fact that the door is unlocked and say that it's very careless, and refer to Rosa as a troublesome person. This ties into a thing that has recurrently been coming up in this episode, especially in the ways in which people will tell parallel stories, basically to ground themselves in different things based on how they are feeling in that moment. In the moment when everyone's looking for Rosa and they're not sure she has died, and let's be honest, they might think she is up to something and they might think she is doing something suspicious. In this moment, they're all quick to blame Rosa, suggest that she's being foolish, suggest that she's making mistakes and that this is a terrible idea and no one should have done this. Because in this moment, they both want to think that if a tragedy was to befall a person, it would be the person's fault and not a terrible consequence visited upon them, regardless of what they did. But also, B, by blaming Rosa, they don't need to confront the alternative possibility that Rosa has already been murdered. Now, it won't take long for them to find out that that is the case, and when that happens, even Rudolph, the kind of fairly crass sibling, will cry over his dead sibling. But up until they're confronted with that, just like with the first Twilight, they can continue to spin the narrative that Rosa's been careless but has ultimately not fully been punished for it. And while they can, they will continue to spin things that way. And pretty much everyone is doing this, spinning multiple different threads for multiple different reasons, including a sickly Ava in bed waking up from a terrible dream where Rosa and Maria have been killed. Conspicuously, her and Hideyoshi seem to be somewhat aware that something has happened to Rosa, and Ava decides to tell herself the story that she's had an awful dream and that the thing she dreamed couldn't be reality because she doesn't want to have to confront reality. I guess in this sense, it is even more explicitly suggesting that the narratives people tell themselves are not based in reality, but are a separate layer that they put on top of things to distance themselves from having to address reality. Of course, as Umineko goes on, what is reality is going to be even more complicated, and it is not particularly straightforward because you can especially look at things in multiple ways. But there is still, in this moment, a refusal to engage with what seems to be the likely outcome. And in terms of different ways to look at how things happened, I guess it's important here to say that I am pretty sure Ava killed both Maria and Rosa. First, killing Rosa accidentally, having an argument where she shoved Rosa tripped, something of that nature, and managed to unfortunately die as a result, but then leading Ava to strangle Maria, the one witness who saw exactly what just happened, where certainly Ava could be seen as culpable, even if people might be willing to accept it as an accident. But again, Ava's tired, Ava's sick, Ava is sleep-deprived, and she is very desperate because of the mountain of gold that she is looking to hold on to. And maybe even a voice has pointed out in her head that no one else knows about that gold once Rosa has been killed. All of this swirling around Ava's mind. I am not going to forgive Ava for child murder, but there is certainly a version of events here that is not as sadistic as young Ava is portrayed to be. Even if, at the same time, there does exist within Ava a satisfaction in dealing with Rosa, a sibling that she has a rivalry with, that she does have gripes with and frustrations with. Even if Ava is higher in the pecking order and has always been the one bullying Rosa as the younger sister, there are ways in which Ava finds Rosa frustrating, and so one can certainly imagine the version of Ava that takes satisfaction from Rosa's death. But a key part of this episode is understanding that that is not the totality of Ava, and that that is not necessarily a fair description of Ava, or a fair read of Ava. As much as she presents herself as a very aggressive person, and very critical, and very quick to attack people, this is all a front, and if you are looking at Ava in her totality, you also have to understand that there is a lot more to her under the surface of that. Speaking of seeing people predominantly as monsters and without a lot of nuance or understanding, Battler becomes incredibly cold to Beato in this section in a way that hurts her way more than their aggressive back and forth had been up to this point. The fired up Battler, where he was calling her awful evil woman, in a funny way, before was more pleasing to Beatrice because he meant he was playing the role that she expected Battler wanted. And, in a sense, that is true. Battler had more fun competing and jostling with her, thinking of her as some evil witch enacting a strange ritual because she had to for her own survival. He says pretty explicitly in this section, he just can't really engage with her and doesn't want to have to even look at her when thinking of her as a person who engages in cruelty for cruelty's sake as a form of enjoyment. When it goes beyond simply, I'm killing people because it's actually necessary for my own existence. In a strange way, Battler was willing to accept that at face value. And Battler's reaction here, he even points out, has less to do with Beatrice's actual actions and has more to do with Beatrice's attitude. He even says that the thing that pushed him over the edge of this is that he saw her watching Ava Triss's murders. It didn't matter that Beatrice was not enacting any harm herself, and that in the end Beatrice in fact gave a merciful death to both of them. What matters is how Beatrice felt in that moment. And this underscores a general ongoing theme here where Ava Triss in particular as a witch thinks that things do not matter besides their objective results. It does not matter if you kill someone repeatedly, since you can just revive them and return them to normal. Except that, as we've said, that absolutely matters because that person remembers being killed over and over. And in a similar way with Beatrice's game boards, Beatrice has a certain detachment from the fates of any of the pieces on her boards because she knows the board is going to reset. She knows all these people are going to come back, they're going to be set up again, and another murder is going to happen. But there are people who remember the loops, and those things still matter. And in a way, this means that there is a lot more weight on a person's attitude and how they feel about things, but also in what they do with the limited time they have. This is going to be more important in a future update, but suffice to say that even if an ending is coming, everyone dies. Everyone is going to have an ending to their life. That doesn't mean you do nothing in the meantime because none of it's going to matter, because while you are still around, while you are still alive, The things you do and say will have an effect on the people directly in front of you. It doesn't matter that they will eventually die. It doesn't matter if they might be dying in minutes. The fact of the matter is, the minutes before then are still crucial and important. And in some ways, because of how the math of time works in this game, sometimes the minutes, by being limited, might be much more precious than if someone had a year and you're being rude to them. And a curious dimension to this is that when Battler says that he will fight against Runaway instead of Beatrice, or Runaway will be her stand-in, he says that Runaway doesn't have the awful tastes Beatrice does, and then quickly corrects himself and says, well, if he does have those tastes, he has the good grace not to show me. This feels like a flaw of Battler's, because a lot of the Ashura-miyas have a lot of cruelty in their hearts. A lot of the Ashura-miyas are abusive, as well as being victims of abuse. Kinzo obviously being the prime example, where in this very episode, Beatrice tried to tell her backstory to Battler, but he refused to acknowledge his grandfather's crimes. And this is an issue of respectability. Battler's grandfather is a noble, respectable head of a household. It would take a lot of work to convince Battler that his father has made some truly awful crimes, has done some truly awful crimes, and never really made reparations for those. Likewise, he is willing to assume that a literal demon from hell is probably fine, because he doesn't show any kind of evil or awful side to him. Despite an interesting wrinkle that often Runaway is the one who has told Beatrice about things Beatrice did, which inspires some of Beatrice's behaviour. I'm not arguing that Runaway is necessarily culpable so much as you could certainly look at the series of events and think that he is intentionally engendering these results. But Battler doesn't, because Runaway just seems like a pleasant butler man. And when Battler is given Beatrice this whole seeing to, there's a fun passage. For a while, Beatrice kept switching between angry expressions, frustrated expressions, bold expressions, as though even she herself didn't know what attitude she should take. Given that Beatrice has constructed a persona specifically to Battler's specifications, it is funny that she is not quite sure what to do in the face of realizing that this is not what he wanted. What she thought he meant and the kind of posturing he presented constructed a certain character, but it's not quite actually what he wanted, and she's not sure how to deal with this information, especially because she can't simply say this is what he was asking for, or that she thought he was asking for this. I like how when people discover the second Twilight, they think that Rosa's gun being left behind must be a trap, because they presume there to be intentionality behind what the killer has done, because they're conflating the first and second Twilights. The first Twilight was very deliberate and staged even, such that they weren't even sure it was real. So they end up collapsing things. When they see the second Twilight, they then think, so the version of events we had before is false. There is in fact a real killer who has killed people and has now killed 2 more people. And despite the evidence that this was a less intentional crime, and a little bit more of a crime of passion, of accident, etc., they then take things that would make that make sense and read them with a kind of intentionality of a calculating killer who has a grand plan that they're trying to unravel. This section sees a more explicit tug of war between Ava and Beatrice, where Beatrice in particular says that she is supporting her magic with Ava's life force. I'd be curious if people have very specific readings of what this is, but I tend to read it as being in the interesting dichotomy of there are many ways to read Ava, but especially with this version of events and with the fact that we do know Ava is the only known survivor of this incident, One could read Ava as being this Machiavellian mastermind who, on discovering the gold, solving the epitaph, etc., intentionally set out to eliminate competition. Things obviously went wrong because I think even people reading Ava poorly would not believe that she'd kill her own family without unfortunate pressure. Like if they didn't support her murder spree, for instance. But young Ava Triss, is the expression of people who think of her as a cruel witch who found gold and let it go to her head. On the other hand, there is the opposite kind of read of Ava, as being a poor woman who suffered a tragedy where she lost all of her family and was left practically alone by it, aside from Angie, who we will be getting to. And there's the notable line where Ava Triss says that Ava will have to bear the burden, which, especially with what life we see Ava is going to lead after this, to me reads as Ava's softer side being cannibalized by this version of Ava, which becomes so prominent in the minds of the public and in Angie's mind that Ava ends up succumbing to it. She ends up being weakened, and her softer side, her more compassionate end, just has to shrink because she's been taken over by the witch power instead. And when they're all going to get food from the mansion, or when Rudolph, Kyrie, and Hideyoshi are going to do that, there's a fun repeat of, as I keep saying, everyone spinning different narrative threads to convince themselves and others of different things. But there's some fun interweaving here of a couple things, where, for one, the gendered expectations of things, where Kyrie, arguably the coldest killer, most experienced with a gun in this whole group, says, "I'll be fine, I'll be with two men who have guns." Rosa was probably killed because she is just a woman with a child. Kyrie is not saying this because she believes in this kind of gendered notion. She knows that the gendered notion is a way in which she can get other people to accept her version of events and what she is suggesting they do. She knows that she can say this and then everyone will feel good about it and will feel as though they are safer. While at the same time, she is saying they need this food because in actuality, she is enacting a wolves and sheep puzzle. She and Rudolph, who are both pretty experienced with guns, are going to take Hideyoshi, who they believe to be an accomplice to the crimes, out of the safety of the guest house, away from everyone else, away from potential other accomplices even, to get him by himself, so the two of them outnumber him and can then discuss things with him. Knowing how Kyrie is, she might intend to kill him, but I think it's probably less escalationist than that, because she probably wants information more than she wants murder. And it's worth pointing out, there is a moment where the gun swaps from being with Hideyoshi to being with Kyrie. She is taking over control of the situation. And she's doing all this knowing that she has to give more palatable and reasonable and less alarmist excuses for why she wants to go get food and why they'll be safe and why they shouldn't be worried about it and they should just be let go do this thing. And then of course we get to have Kyrie face off against one of the stakes, and she gets some fun lines that are pretty revealing of her character. I do like the underplayed I do like the straightforward seeming "I can be cruel when my husband is not around" line, where obviously the more surface reading is just, hey, I can be pretty cruel. But there's even an interesting read of that where she has permission to be cruel when he's not around, because she's not showing him up anymore. She is supposed to be the wife, but she is clearly the colder and she's clearly the more cold and calculating person of the two, and is pretty willing and happy to be cruel, especially with the rest of her speech here. And it is funny that it's funny that Leviathan talks about her envy for Kyrie's complete trust in her husband, when actually Kyrie then talks about, I'm still jealous of his ex-wife. I wish she had died sooner. I wish Battler had died so I could have my own child instead. Despite the fact that, in fact, Battler is her child, and actually Rudolph swapped the babies because he did want to be with Asumu. It was not merely circumstance, but he managed to make a circumstance in which he could present as if he hadn't made a choice. It's a messy situation. And Kyrie in this section gives a very definitive and insistent version of events that Asumu manipulated Rudolph, and that Rudolph was just being puppeted against his will or without his real knowledge or awareness. However, if he was the one to swap the babies, then it seemed like he was pretty actively making a choice in this moment. However, Kyrie needs to tell herself that that's not the case, because the envy she felt for his ex-wife has not gone away for 18 years, even after his ex-wife's death. That envy burns her, and would burn her much worse if she was willing to admit that she knew Rudolph wanted her more than he wanted Kyrie. Because it seems notable that the envy has burned for 18 years. Not just until Kyrie got Rudolph back, but did not stop while they were together. After the murders have been enacted, we get a good parallel where Beatrice is basically saying, if this battler person is on the other side of the layer that divides the game board and the meta level, then if I'm never going to personally and directly interact with him, why should I care? Why should I have any interest? He is simply a distant person who is not a direct... He is simply a distant person who has no impact on my life. And this serves to highlight to Beatrice the kind of cruelty and indifference she had been showing to the game pieces, where it is not that she had no direct connection to them, but she had a big gap between them. The meta level is so distant from the game board that she feels like they are beneath notice, in a way that Beatrice now feels to Beatrice, where even if in theory you are powerful, I have clearly shown my skills and I don't need to care about you anymore, and I don't need to care about this other person who just seems separate and who just doesn't seem to impact my life in particular. And we have Hideyoshi pleading with Beatrice to stop her unnecessary onslaught. It is noticeable that he is not surprised by Ava's presence, he's not surprised by the murders, he is chastising her for having done this, which to me speaks to Ava as a culprit and Hideyoshi as an accomplice. But also, being here, distant from the guest house, away from other listening in ears, he has a moment to properly hash it out with her, where he is straight up like, why are you even doing this? How could there be so much gold it was tempting to you, and yet it wasn't so much gold that you could share it and not have to care? Why is this so important that you would want all of the gold? And he is trying to reason with the very childish excess of Ava. He's trying to reason with a version of Ava that is rooted in childhood traumas and in a childhood dream that was unreasonable at the time but has resurfaced. Unresolved tensions in Ava that he is trying to reach back to and deal with, but just like with Kyrie's envy, Ava has had many years for this tension to build up, without any real release. As much as Ava has found success in various areas of her life, this particular one has gotten no closer for her, until this very weekend introduces the possibility. But another way I read this section, we have to bring in the authorship angle of these things, because we have said, as I have said before, each of these episodes is written by a particular person or people. The first two were ones that Beatrice herself wrote about potential revenge plots she could enact. Those are ones sent out in message bottles that people found. This third one is written by somebody else. In part, this third one is written by the general mystery-solving public. The fandom that builds up around this in-universe true crime story. And one could see Hideyoshi's pleading here to be not pleading with an actual Eva, but pleading with this fictional construct. He says, that personality isn't Eva, it's a completely different human. In a later episode, we will be told outright that pieces on the game board will act in line with their character. People will not entirely act out of character, so that if someone does something on a game board, at least within certain circumstances, they could potentially do that. And so some of the Eva-Beatrice split could be about the fact that despite the stories people tell, despite what the Shurimiya fandom spins up about what happened here, Eva is simply not this unrelentingly cruel. For this person to be on the board, it has to be a witch, it has to be a separation from Eva's quote-unquote true personality. Again, there is cruelty within Eva, but the unabashed, unrelenting, and immature cruelty that simply has learned nothing from age and has not learned to temper her worst impulses, this is not Eva. And Hideyoshi knows this and is pleading with fake Eva and is pleading with the reader or the narrator, all three I suppose. And unfortunately, he is murdered for his efforts. And I find his murder scene interesting because it is not explicit that Eva herself does this. It is simply that the gun floats up and shoots him. And then, after the fact, Beatrice is very dampened, and her Beatrice's mood is extremely dampened and disquieted by what has just happened. She's not glad that it happened, she's not gleeful or joyful the way she has been with other people. That in itself also speaks to the fact that she is not unrelentingly cruel without purpose or without tempering that in any way. But part of that scene does make me want to transition to theorizing about exactly what is going on this island. So let's talk about how all of this was done. And I think a key part of how this was done is that at least one body from the first Twilight survived. Maybe more than one, but as usual I am going to be stingy with how many people I think are acting until I get to a point at which it is required for there to be extra people. And as I've said, clearly Eva is a key culprit in this situation, and I think this is a situation where Beatrice exists and is taking actions, and then because Eva solves the epitaph, Eva gets to take over and Eva becomes the true culprit, with Beatrice in Shannon/Cannon's body as an accomplice. We know that Shannon/Cannon's body would have to have moved regardless because of the fact that it was found in two separate locations, quote-unquote dead, but as we know that just means Shannon/Cannon's personalities died. At which point there is at least one unaccounted for person. Obviously, you could also say that Kumasawa's body may exist in the form of Virgilia, although the meta level seems to imply that Virgilia's body has straight up been killed. However, Ronave's could easily also be active, and it is more implied that he is assisting original Beatrice, so in that sense, he's quite likely acting for her, and would be helpful in outnumbering people. But who could say? It's not necessarily clear at this point if that's actually the case. When Kyrie, Rudolph, and Hideyoshi go back to the mansion, it is clear that Kyrie knows something is up, and is not 100% sure what, and probably wants to test the hypothesis as well as talk with her husband. And as I said earlier, this is a wolves and sheep situation where she is trying to get them to outnumber the wolf, which is Hideyoshi. And I think she might even be intentionally setting up a situation where she's trying to bait out a further accomplice. The fact that she manages to detect that an ambush has been set for them, and Hideyoshi's reaction to that being, we should just go through the front entrance. Let's stop being weird about this. Let's just hurry up and go through the front entrance, where the ambush clearly is. That's pretty suspicious on his part. Now, what nature of an accomplice he is less clear to me. Especially with what's happened in the scene, I do not think of him as a person who would want to help with murdering anyone as much as he wants to support his wife. However, circumstances may push him to that point. Especially if, for instance, Kyrie found some cigarettes outside, knew they happened to be the brand that Hideyoshi smoked, and then thought, Hideyoshi, when were you outside? Why were you smoking? And how did you now happen to notice Rosa in that moment? Is it possible that Hideyoshi either is the one who talked to Rosa and might have killed her, or is Hideyoshi in some way one who went out to do cleanup, to find the body, to understand what had happened, and had to deal with the stressful situation of knowing what his wife had gotten them into? Either way, he is suspicious, and if he was being confronted with that, I could imagine a Beatrice accomplice responding in kind to help him out. Whether or not Ava herself would also appear there is a different matter. I think it is complicated for her to be able to get there, though not impossible. And in a certain sense, Hideyoshi's argument with the other accomplice could make sense if, for instance, Hideyoshi, Rudolph, and Kyrie go to the mansion. Rudolph and Kyrie basically corner Hideyoshi and want to get something out of him, get some information, and reveal how much they do know and suspect. An accomplice shoots one or both of them in order to protect Hideyoshi. At which point Hideyoshi is like, what are you doing? Stop. No, we are not doing more of this. Why would you do that? At which point, if there's a further altercation, the accomplice may have to shoot Hideyoshi. Or, given that both Kyrie and Rudolph are quite experienced with guns, it is also possible that in an altercation, both sides take losses, where Hideyoshi gets killed as well as Rudolph and Kyrie. Even with the element of surprise, both of them are pretty capable, so I would not be surprised if they managed to get a shot off enough to kill Hideyoshi, effectively as a reflex. We still have some bit to go. I know there's red text, even from this very episode, to come to deal with Hideyoshi and his function as an accomplice or not. So I will have to refine this as time goes on, because regrettably, this feels very appropriate to the text of the game itself too. You tend to, from the third episode on, the actual intellectual battle tends to get a little bit sparser. There's a lot of delayed gratification as it gets concentrated into certain sections. And I know there's going to be a long section to come with some debate. Thank you for watching. Please do comment if you have thoughts on what I've said. I am happy for spoiler thoughts, but anything about the actual mystery, please try to spoiler, and I will wait until I've gotten to the last episode to then read those and respond to those, because it's always been fun to find things I've overlooked or missed, such as me being too trusting of Goda in episode 2. That was a difficult one to read. But that's it for now. Thank you all for watching, and see you in the next video.